Welcome to Todd Neve's show, where I attempt to learn out loud from interesting people with interesting ideas, interesting models of the world, interesting experiences, and this week we have none other than Jeff Kolar on the podcast. Jeff actually edits most of these episodes, so he's behind the scenes moving audio files around, reducing noise, using the razor tool in Adobe Audition to make these things sound pretty reasonable. So this time Jeff is being interviewed by me, since Jeff has a bunch of really interesting things going on. He is a sound artist, a performance artist, a musician, and I wanted to get his take on the way that he actually thinks about creating his art, since there's a lot of differences between the high art world and the music world, and some crossover as well. So we kind of break some of that stuff down, how he actually thinks about his work in an art sense versus in a music sense. And Jeff also put out, I think, two of his best works this last year. One of them is a collaboration with the harpist Zeena Parkins, which is fantastic. So we talk a bunch about that. And then he also had a work called Ditch that came out this last year that, I think I said this on my recent interview with Preston from A Feather and Bone. And, if a lot of folks listen to kind of like ambient study music or whatever when they're trying to work. And I would highly recommend checking out some of Jeff's stuff. No words to distract you. So we'll have links to all of that in the show notes. His Bandcamp has a ton of different projects on it. So Jeff, very interesting guy, background in BMX as well, which is great, right? Anyone who has a physical craft, a musical craft, intelligent ideas about why they're doing what they're doing, those are the kind of people you want to listen to. So enjoy this interview with Jeff Kolar. All right, Jeff. So one of the questions that I have for you that I haven't asked you in real life that came up as I was sort of preparing to do a formal interview with you is you did some work with smoke detectors. And I'm curious if you inspired the Nathan For You sketch involving a smoke detector being used as a musical instrument. Is this true?
It's like a true and false, It's funny you brought that up because I was in communication with him when that came out because, it's funny. So the smoke detector project I did in, I think, 2014 or something like that. It was like in the middle, before the show came out. And for the listeners who maybe don't know my work, this smoke detector project was a lot of my work, my early work was kind of like investigating the sort of like sonic nuances of like everyday electronics. So I was working with like doorbells and car alarms and smoke detectors and turning these into kind of like art projects. And so for the smoke detector, I was really interested in it because it was like early on I was kind of making work about like the most annoying sounds I could like think of. And wanting to remake them and remix them and like turn them into something different. And when the smoke detector, that's like the worst if it's not in your place, right? So like I've experienced for years, like you live in an apartment and then like somewhere above or below you, the smoke detector is going.
Oh, totally.
off.
Or it's in the stairwell. So it's like no one's actual responsibility. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And like you don't have the ladder to climb up there. And like, do you want to risk falling just to like change out a 9-volt battery? You don't have a 9-volt battery. You probably got to run to the pharmacy to, there's so many annoyances related to like the smoke detector dying. And I was like, perfect spot to make art, And so I had this idea that I was going to like remake the smoke detectors into instruments. Because part of what I was doing was also being really interested in circuit bending. And for the folks who don't know what circuit bending is, it's kind of like finding electronics that usually produce sound. So like a really easy example of that is like like a kid's toy keyboard. And you take it apart and you kind of like play around and touch it and see how you can freak it out, like turn a regular keyboard into like an alien, so to speak. You resolder and you put it back together. And, I was really into that culture. There's a whole sort of like movement DIY, like this idea of reappropriation, like hacking as a sort of like political act, breaking apart commercial objects and like turning them into something that you want to do something different with. I thought that was kind of radical and cool. Um, and
Yeah, wait, let me interrupt you and ask you a question about that real quick. Was this I remember there's this band Creationist Crucifixion that super strange released this record that had like a hacked Game Boy situation. It was like a hacked Game Boy game that, and this is, I wish I had this story more clear, but it was something that like taught children about sex. And you're like, what in the world is going on here? Right? Like, like I'm trying to listen to this metalcore band and all of a sudden I'm being introduced to this very strange hacked Game Boy game with some sort of like questionable content associated with it. Is this adjacent to what you're talking about?
kind of, you're talking about chiptune,
Great.
which is like, so chiptune is a genre of music, electronic music that is produced from hacking Game Boys. I've been to one chiptune like festival. There was one here in Chicago, maybe like 8 years ago, and it was pretty wild. Like people like moshing to like a woman on stage like playing 3 Game Boys and like, but it sounded insane. Sometimes it sounds like Game Boy music, but they're like literally playing games, finding them, like making music, like on like DJing using different games with Game Boys, but they're also modifying the Game Boy so you can like slow down the pitch or turn the pitch up, or like kind of effects, like, or like run it through effect pedals. But the main idea is that you're using the Game Boy as the instrument. So that's called chiptune, and that's like a whole, like, it's really fast, super. It's like Game Boy music. It's cool that it was like inserted into another genre. I figure people do stuff like that.
Yeah, it was confusing to me as a 16-year-old or whatever. But anyway, back to your story.
Yeah, so I was doing, really into circuit bending. So I wanted to redesign the smoke detector into something like beautiful. I think a lot of my early work was kind of centered around this idea that like very banal, everyday sounds that you're so accustomed to, when you just alter them slightly, can change everything. Like I even did a project with ice cream trucks, where I was in Bridgeport, actually at Co-Prosperity Sphere, where I hired an ice cream truck to show up, and I like played my remixed version of the ice cream truck songs as it drove around a neighborhood and sold ice cream to people, and that was like my part of the exhibition. So I was like always trying to find like ways that you could sort of like reimagine or look at something differently by just like, having some sort of like artistic intervention. And so I made the smoke detectors, and I made a whole album out of it. But part of that was I actually like went out and sourced and like bought like broken smoke detectors, ripped all of the interior guts out, which is actually like highly toxic because there's a radioactive material inside of smoke detectors. So if you puncture it, it will burn you, or I don't know, like make you disintegrate or something. But that's like how the actual smoke detector works. Is it's not about fire or smoke. It's actually about heating up a source in that smoke detector, and then when it trips that, it will tell an alarm to go off. So it's a really simple circuit. But what you normally hear is just like beep, beep. You hear like one audible tone, right? And that's like a frequency. And so what I did was I redesigned the smoke detector to be like a playable. So they had knobs on them that would control like pitch or speed. And then instead of having just one beep, I designed like a little sequencer so I could like make a beat, and it wouldn't have to be like just one frequency. I would have a couple of those speakers in there, and I could be like beep, 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 and then I could also circuit bend it and kind of do things to it to make it sound weird. So I designed these actual like physical objects and installed it in a show, and I had like a horrible first performance with it, like because I had the idea of performing it. I installed them on the ceiling in the gallery, And so the only way when you'd walk in, like you'd see the smoke detector and it would be on, like making a sound, but you couldn't access it. And so I wanted to do a performance where I was up on a ladder, and like performing. And like I just would never do that again, because like I understood, like actually when I'm performing, I like have crazy deep amount of concentration going on. All musicians kind of talk about, like, you get in a zone and you're concentrating, and like I was just fucking terrified I was gonna fall off the ladder.
Well, did your shoulders get tired too? Because I feel like every time you have to change the battery in a smoke detector, and you're like struggling to get the thing off, you're like, I can't keep my arms up anymore. I'm dying. I've been doing this for 30 seconds.
Exactly. Yeah, and I was doing that with two arms in the air and twisting and trying to listen, but also like looking down and like, just remembering that if I like went into some other kind of performance state and I lose my balance, like I'm on the ground. So it didn't, but it was pretty cool. It was effective. And then I also turned the project into a CD release. And the CD I was really proud of, because the CD is a regular standard CD is the exact same size as the smoke detector. So like the CD actually like turned into, like, I kind of just ripped off packaging from this like early 80s like hardcore looking smoke detector, and then you sort of open the CD and then you pull it out and it is the same. It looks like a smoke detector. I had it printed on there. So the idea is that you could buy the CD and burn it, and then you could like install the CD on your ceiling, and it would be this kind of like fake, not working smoke detector. That was like its afterlife idea for me. And then I performed that project one other time, where I tried to do like a rock and roll version with actual like a smoke machine. And that was way more effective because I was playing through like a huge PA system, and I kind of had them mic'd, and it was kind of like more put together. So I did that in like 2014, and then the Nathan For You episode came out.
Yeah, totally.
And then I was getting mad texts being like, "Yo, this is literally you. Like this is based on you." And then I watched the episode, and I thought it was hilarious that he, I don't know if he ever saw it, but then I started sending him messages, and I was like, hey, this has already been done before, because I thought it would be like a la the style of him, where like maybe this could turn into like another thing. And I kept sending him messages on Instagram and Twitter, and like I think one of the tweets actually like kind of took off because I just like A-B'd it. I was like, here's my version, and then people were kind of like into it. And I had like it got retweeted, like that one was like 60 or 70 times, and they're adding him, and I heard like nothing from him ever. And same with on Instagram. And then one day I like popped open Instagram and I just saw that it said seen. And then so that's the only indication that I've ever had. Like I never wrote him a cease and desist. But he fucking stole that idea from me, I guess.
Yeah. That's so funny.
I want a Nathan For You on that, but I've never had a good comeback for it.
Well, you know what, man? I think that in the art world, you put your work out there, and it gets recombined endlessly into different permutations, and people can express their creativity. And there you go. You're part of the postmodern conversation surrounding smoke detectors being used as sound art.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a huge fan of remix culture, and like appropriation is like the name of my game, so to speak. Which is why I kind of wanted to have some fun with it, but he didn't bite. Yeah. He didn't bite. So, maybe in the future, but it was kind of funny, like a couple of like new media art blogs who found the project before, like reposted, as like a kind of lineage, like there's been one article that was wrote on smoke detectors, and like both of those things got in. So it's kind of cool, like if they're in the same conversation, that's great.
Yeah.
And actually, it's just funny because, that episode is hilarious.
I mean, it's one of the best ones, for sure.
It's so good. And like part of my work back then was also like I was trying, humor was like in the work. Like I go for that. Like I know that it's funny to try to make a smoke detector soft, or like all these things that I was doing. So it's cool to see that he sort of took that joke one step further, and just kind of like he definitely did it more of a better joke than me, because mine was kind of like also a conceptual art project. So it was kind of like funny that I had this dual, like, oh, this is a real serious piece and people are looking at it like art, and it's being viewed in that context. And then a few years later, it's just like, well, here's the joke side of it kind of expanded. I thought it was so cool.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I mean, if we were to say, okay, if Nathan Fielder did in fact get this idea from you, and then was getting reached out to by you, I think especially at that stage that you probably end up in some weird situations with who owns the rights to the show, the network, et cetera. And it's like, if we start playing around with this, you potentially expose yourself to all kinds of weird liability situations, and can make it challenging, I think, to engage on that level, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, best case scenario, I was just like, I remember messaging and be like, yo, what's your address? Like, I want to send you a CD.
Yeah.
Like he would probably I think if he got that CD, he would be fucking floored about it.
Totally.
He could think, even if he didn't realize it was made before, and he just thought it was fan art or, whatever. Like, I think I was just trying to get in touch to be like, yo, I think you would find this to be really funny if you made this whole skit. Like, but yeah, if anybody out there who listens to the podcast can get me in touch, or give me an address, PO box. I know he lives in Austin because he recently made a really funny tweet early on with the UPS. I don't know if you saw that one, but
what was it?
there was like during kind of like when there was more people in the streets for Black Lives Matter, and that there was a case of like in Dallas, a police station that put out a photo of like thank you cards that were like, when you zoomed in, they were like all the same like signature and like handwriting.
Yeah.
And so he made a version of it where he like stuffed duffel bags full of fan mail and was like, thanks so much to all my fans for all the like bundles of mail. It was it was just so funny, like a really nice like whole kind of episode in a tweet,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the fake fan mail is classic behavior. Well, yeah, I would love to see a smoke detector collaboration between you and Nathan if you'd be willing to reprise your earlier work, right? Two fellas on a, maybe go somewhere with short ceilings if you wanted to put them on the ceiling again, like a nice like a basement with like a 7-foot clearance or something, so that maybe you could get on a short step stool to do it rather than having to be on an actual ladder. I do think the smoke machine itself is important, right? Because that kind of adds context for the detectors going off. And I think that, wonderful art and beautiful music could be created in that scenario. So I would love to see it.
And the great thing is, he's got a full band for the smoke detector, and I'm just a solo. So I realize he's got a lot of fan power there.
Dude, that's incredible. So I do want to ask you kind of a zoomed out question just about sound art and the more like academic high art version of creating some of these types of things, right? Some of the stuff that you're talking about, repurposing everyday sounds, the broader like artistic conversation compared to some stuff that's being created that's more specifically like in the music world, right? That I'm more familiar with personally. So stuff that's, ambient music, noise music, even some jazz kind of stuff, electronic, et cetera, right? Where there seems to be people who are creating that stuff that's like, okay, here's my record here, maybe there is some sort of artistic conception of what I'm doing compared to other folks who are making things to be performed in a gallery or as part of a sort of like you were discussing, a more artistic reconceptualization of, everyday objects or part of a broader art conversation. And I guess I'm just curious, since I don't know enough to have super specific questions about this, what is your take on this? Since I know you're kind of plugged into both worlds, like how do they relate to each other?
Yeah, they're really intertwined. I think that like it's about kind of intention usually. And just like any artist, like when you're making work, you have to think about who your audience is, and where you want your work to live, so to speak, or to be cited or to be consumed. Um, and the a sound artist might have more of a interest in like the space itself, or being literally like in a museum rather than in a rock venue. um, but like my experience is kind of unique in the sense that I've kind of like taken a stab at all of it, because I've always found that one of the most appealing things of like being in sound art or music, whatever you want to call it, is that you're especially as a sound artist, you have the opportunity to put your work out in kind of so many different trajectories. And I've really tried super hard to do that with my own work. And what I mean by that is that, um, my goal might be to, for instance, the smoke detector, just to kind of go off of that one. I'm framing it in a kind of art context. I was invited to be in an exhibition, but I'm also interested in putting out as a CD and kind of trying to make it live in that way. But I'm also performing it live. And the cool thing about sound art is that you can kind of have, your output as an artist has so much rich opportunities, rather than, I don't want to say it's better, but like, say, if you compare it to a painter who, you would have to kind of consume that work either in a gallery, or you'd have to buy it and then have it in your house, or you look at an image of that online. But with a sound artist, you kind of have the opportunity to like be a performer live. You could be a composer where you're just composing music or sound for something. You could be making work that is about sound, that's not even making sound, but maybe it's a visual work that's about, like sonic, something sonic. Whereas like people who are, say making like what you're calling like ambient music or electronic music or noise, or that's a very different scene, but they're mixed in and the artists may go back and forth. But the people in that scene might be more interested in doing live shows. They want to perform in front of people, and they want to record and put out records. But a sound artist, they very different intention. Like their work might not demand any of that to like get noticed or get seen. So I think that like it's kind of a space where you can play in both of them. And for me personally, I just always let the work take me to new places. And so like I never started off being interested in wanting to perform live. I kind of came into being into this world like through an art context, and then kind of entered the music scene where and it can go the opposite way, where there are people who are sound artists now who probably started playing guitar first, and their work reads really differently in an art context. Even like you see that the intention of their work is maybe different from someone who's like studying in art as the kind of way that they're starting their process. For instance, like musicians, they might just like their process of making work might be just rehearsing or improvising or playing and just like doing music, playing with people. Whereas sound artists might be like writing or recording, and but the kind of intention is maybe a little bit different behind what they're trying to put out.
Yeah, so
That
let
makes
me
sense.
ask you just about, because I think that what you're saying about the intention makes sense. So I guess I'm curious what your take is on the difference in intention, because my first impulse would be that someone who's coming at it more from a musician standpoint, or someone who's treating their music more like, oh, I'm in a band and I'm making a record and performing live, right? That their intention is more, okay, I like this music and I want to make something that sounds like either a band or artist that I like, or something that I'm imagining in my head, and I want to create that. Whereas an artist is potentially coming at it more like, I'm commenting on something through the sounds that I'm creating. Does that seem accurate? How would you adjust my framing there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really just going to be on like an individual basis. But I do agree with you that like, and I guess I've taken to this more because I'm labeled as so many different things, and it's kind of like, not like, I'm not saying it's messed with my complex, but it's just made me think that like how malleable your work is. So like you can be called a composer, a musician, a sound artist. I think all of those words become a little bit interchangeable. But I think that the, that I definitely don't have this opinion that like one is like more of a creative person than the other, or that one is like a better approach. But I think it's more about what you enjoy out of the process, and then also like knowing what scene you want to be in. And for me, that was always something huge. Was like knowing where your work fits, because I'll be honest with you, some people who make sound art, it can't stand up as music, like
Sure.
it's not supposed to. It's like it's supposed to be some other thing, that might be a gallery installation that you're supposed to experience in person. And if you just listen to it as on SoundCloud or as a record, you might be missing the entire mark. And I come into this with my own work a lot, is like, especially when I work with dancers, I make music for dance, and then if I turn that into like a record or an album, I remake the whole thing, because the original
Oh,
doesn't
got it.
is
Yeah.
not even interesting to listen to as music, but it's fascinating when there's dancers in the room. But I have to remake everything to make it listenable from like start to finish as an album. Whereas it's super strong when I have 5 minutes of silence when dancers are doing cool, intricate work with lights, and I'm making some soft, gentle noise that when you're there, it's like exactly what you want. But if you're listening to it from as like thinking about it like music, it's not gonna be good, or it's not gonna sound like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually, I want to hear more about that, because one thing that I was thinking about your stuff is that, a lot of it does come more from this quote unquote sound art
Hmm.
sphere, but it is still listenable, right? Like you said, that, some sound artists, you're not going to put on, their record and listen to it or whatever, even though it might be compelling when experienced as part of a gallery exhibition or as part of a performance or whatever. But it does seem like almost all of your stuff, you can actually listen to it, right? It might be somewhat abrasive, or if someone doesn't have the ear for it, they might not enjoy listening to weird smoke detector sounds, right? That they might be like, this is not really what I'm into, like, and that's okay. But I didn't realize that you actually would take stuff that you had written for a performance and then adjust it before releasing
Hmm.
it. So what does that look like? Do you have, whatever the outline of what you want the different sounds to be like, and how those are going to coincide with, let's say, a dance? And then if you're going to release it, then you just kind of compress that outline, or do you rework everything? Do you re-perform it? What actually happens?
Well, I'll just give like a example of just, I guess, the last thing that I did that for was, I made I co-wrote or co-composed music for a dance, uh, that was by this choreographer named Jennifer Monson, um, and I co-authored it with this woman named Zeena Parkins, who is a harpist, experimental harpist. She has an incredible career. She started, became kind of known in the sort of downtown scene in New York in the '90s for improvisation, um, and has had a tremendous career of working with. She co-wrote two of Bjork's albums and performed as Bjork's harpist. Has worked and extensively in kind of the improvisation world, and that's where people know her, is sort of in the jazz and improvisation. John Zorn, she's like in that kind of whole sphere. So for that project, we made an entire work, an evening length piece, and I think it was the actual performance was maybe like 70 minutes or something like that. And we wrote all the music. It took like 2.5 years for us to make the project, from start to finish, from like nothing to an entire piece. We did like several residencies that were like months or 2 months long, where we would all go somewhere and work on the project, and then we did that for a long time. Um, Come up with the actual work. The process of the dancers that I work with is really different than other, from what I understand from other people who work with choreographers. Sometimes the scenario is, I have a dance. Here's the dance. Make music, and you don't have have any kind of relationship. They just want you to like, or you give them a sample pack and then they listen to it in rehearsal and they just make, they choose it. Like that's kind of one way that you can get commissioned to make music for a dance. I've been lucky enough that the choreographer I primarily work with, I am in the process from the very first day in the room with the dancers, the lighting designer, the stage manager. And so it's sort of like we're birthing the entire project together, which is an way more fruitful experience than just someone coming and asking you for tracks. But for instance, like if you were in the quote unquote music world, like you were saying before, I mean, it might be fine with just dropping some tracks for like a runway show or something, like that could be totally cool. But I'm a little bit more interested in being in the entire process of making. So we make the project, and then we were approached by a label in Detroit called Two Room Records to put it out because it's a record label that focuses only about releasing artists from Detroit, and Zeena was born and raised in Detroit. So we turned it into a record, but we kind of took that idea of compressing things. So oftentimes when you work with dance, you think about it in sections as you would like normal music, and you attribute random names. Like there's a one section that might be called traveling, and another one is called pulse, and you write all the music for all those works, and then those kind of turn into tracks somehow. But for our processes, we had to re-record the entire thing. We recorded the live show, a performance that we did, and multi-tracked it and everything. But we didn't just remix it. We had to rewrite the whole thing and then re-record everything based on the fact that we wanted to turn it into an LP. So we also had a time limitation. So we in that case, it was kind of like remaking the whole piece, but knowing and having all the music written, but just rewriting it. To actually have it serve as something that you could be interesting to keep your attention for the whole time, rather than having, like I said, in the actual performance, there's 2 sections of like 8 minutes of silence that I wouldn't want to put in the record.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I was thinking that, it might make sense to just record the live performance and then chop that up to release it, right? Where it's like, yeah, you may edit out these 8 minutes of silence or whatever, or you may have some theme that plays, at a certain time based upon what's happening with the actual visual of the dancers performing. But if you have those tracks, then you could just say, okay, cool, let's turn this into something that more resembles either a song or a specific soundscape or whatever. But it sounds like that for you actually just said, you know what, it's cool that we have these live recordings, but we're just going to fully redo it based upon the same outline and the same parts that we have, but perform it this time specifically for release as a record. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. But I have also done the thing that you said, which is just hit record and then edit it down and turn it into a release. I have done that, but I think I learned through doing that a couple times that it never quite captured what it was like to be there in person. And that always like bothered me as an artist, that I was like, when I would hear it, I would be experiencing the work with the dance, which is so strong. There's no better like if you think a music video is of like video and audio synced is cool, like when you have live dancers and live people playing music, like there's a really magic, special moments that happen and are crafted specifically for that. And then I just kind of, when I would hear it as a release, I was like, oh, the impact isn't there. So this last time when I rewrote the entire thing with Zeena, I can't imagine not doing that again. I think I will continue to kind of like use like kind of quote unquote, you would call them stems, like in electronic music, like you create a bunch of stems. And I would never hit record and then just chop it up and edit it. I think I would always, going forward after having that experience, I just saw how much stronger the work got when you looked at it from a different perspective. And also recognizing that there are strengths that you can use as tools as a performer live that are really effective, that just don't translate at all to a recorded thing, or even something that's supposed to be like listened to like wherever the hell people listen on their headphones or big speakers or whatever.
Yeah, just like a phone on the
Or a
table
phone,
or
yeah,
whatever
exactly.
people do.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Which you have to
totally.
mix and, like you have to mix and master for all those things according to, you want to make stuff sound good through someone's phone. But for me, it kind of sucks because my work is always, like, I really feel like it's the most effective and it's the most, I love low end bass. I use it so, it's just like I have such tools that kind of create more drama in the work that you experience when you're in the audience than when you do through a release. But I've always just wanted to kind of have the output of doing all of those things just because I was kind of like, well, why not? Like you might not turn into a recording artist or something, but you're definitely going to get better at the process of putting out your music. And so just, I've always kind of had that drive to just want to figure out how to navigate my way through all of the things that I can within my like skill set and interests. And there are other artists who do this in a really cool way. Like, for instance, Ben Frost, pretty famous electronic music artist in the kind of quote unquote noise world. He also made the score and soundtrack for Dark, the Netflix show. So, and there's also been sound artists who, a famous sound artist made the score for that show Chernobyl, which was like a beautiful, like really well done. She just did field recordings like in actual Chernobyl with like, a regular cheap Zoom microphone and made the entire series work just off of like field recordings. And then she did it all in the studio. But Ben Frost did for Dark, he's using synthesizers and dark music. So, these worlds can kind of like intertwine. And I think the important part is just to kind of like be true and know which one you're working in and which one feels the best. And for me, I've taken much more recently to performing and doing that kind of stuff rather than the art exhibition. I don't really show my work as much in like art shows anymore, but I do talk at like art schools and talk about my work in that context. But I just like the gallery thing was never really, I didn't like, I always want to go to a show and hang out in a dark room rather than go to a bright space where it's like really white. I don't know. That's like,
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
that's my vibe.
dingy basements
Yeah.
with exposed wiring rather than galleries with white walls.
Yeah, that's kind of like my background in like getting into like anything cultural at all was like through going to like underground show, like little basement shows in Chicagoland area. And like that's kind of like how I found out about it. And like I kind of, my work has kind of like circled back and into it, or not necessarily playing in basements, but
Sure. Well, and I mean, you have a background in BMX as well, right? And I think that kind of like BMX, skate, whatever culture is definitely adjacent to punk, hardcore, whatever culture, which interestingly, I do think has informed the more high art world for, generations of folks at this point, right? Where you see the aesthetic that was kind of developed in punk album covers kind of filtering into things that are more in that like gallery art world. Because I mean, I think for the exact reason that you're saying, that a lot of the people who end up making art, their introduction to culture was through being 14 and getting some record that like scared them and made their parents mad,
yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, BMX was like a big thing. Like, so yeah, for those who don't know, BMX stands for bicycle motocross, and it's kind of,
I actually just don't think I even knew what that stood for.
yeah, it's
That's
called
really funny.
bicycle motocross. It had, it's like it had this history in the 70s. It started off as like racing, where people would just haul ass on the track and see who wins. Then it turned into freestyle and street riding, and it's kind of like the much uh, not as, it's like the less cool skateboarding, kind of like it's just not as big as skateboarding. And a lot of that has to do with because like a custom BMX bike is like $1,000 and a skateboard is $150. So but it also draws a lot of weird people. It's like a lot of strange people got into that. But yeah, I was like traveling all over the place when I was a teenager doing that. And that kind of also really helped me just understand how you get your name out there, like as an artist or as whatever, is like traveling, showing up, like putting in the work, like for me back then, it was like traveling and going to contests or meeting people. And, I translated all that knowledge directly to my art career right away, where I was like, if I want to get noticed or get opportunities, like I have to get out there, and especially if you're performing. And so I put a lot of, like self-directed tours in Europe that I tossed together all myself, like early on, just because I was like, had a couple connects out there, so it's kind of like the same mentality. And I don't know, BMX and skateboarding is really all about like getting your ass kicked handed to you and like getting back up and doing it again, like literally like falling and getting up like over and over again and breaking bones and like, but you still love it so much that you're like showing up. And so I always kind of like, more recently I've thought about how that taught me like a lot of life lessons, or just like if your passion is there, like I can like take a beating and like kind of I'm like not going to give up on the thing that like brings me a lot of happiness.
Yeah, totally. That any trick worth landing requires just falling on that trick over and over and over and over again before you
Yeah.
actually get it.
Yeah, I still do it. I still ride BMX. I was saying earlier, and I only do like 2 tricks now, but I've been working on them
What are
for.
they? What
I
are your
do.
remaining tricks? And
Yeah, I do.
just to clarify too for folks, I mean, I think you're being somewhat modest about it, but you were doing BMX at an extremely high level as a pretty young person, right? I mean, I don't know how old you were when you were doing all that stuff, but it was like it was the real deal. It wasn't just like, oh yeah, Jeff like can do a bunny hop and went to the skate park, right? It was like you were competing and performing at a very high level.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I guess I was like looking back, I was kind of like an amateur. They call it like an am. But I was like, yeah. I mean, I went to Europe when I was 16 for the first time to go ride at a contest on like someone got me a plane ticket to get out there, like this company.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was like, I wasn't like a paid full on, I wasn't sponsored by Monster Energy and on the X Games, but I was like kind of like in the mix and, in magazines or in videos and like with the right people uh, and like on that trajectory hardcore. And then I kind of like switched gears, had a real bad injury. And then while I was in the hospital, I applied to go to college. And then I ended up going and got like, took my first art class when I was like 19. And then kind of just switched careers sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
You're like, I love art.
yeah, I just kind of like changed it up, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, for the longest time, I thought I was just going to keep doing the BMX thing, but I don't know. The injuries got to me pretty early. I had a couple bad injuries, and I think that kind of I was also someone who had like other interests, and I saw like a lot of people in that world, and it's unfortunate. I see it now as like people who you become you got to have more than one interest in life. You can't rest on your laurels or whatever the thing is. And for me, I don't know, I'm just passionate about a lot of things. So I moved on and became quickly obsessed with something else. And this is more part of my personality is like, back then I would ride like 6 hours every day or something hardcore. And then I just transferred that energy into something else. And then you see what happens with that.
Yeah. So what are the 2 tricks that you'll still do?
Two tricks: tabletop. They call it a tabletop, which is like it's kind of just when you lean like you go in the air and you just lean your bike over. It's really simple. It's not like any kind of a trick. It's more just like looks stylish, and I love the feeling of it. And then I still do spins. I do like 360s. I still love doing 360s, but I pretty much only ride very specific stuff. I ride concrete pools and bowls. That's all I do anymore because it's good on your body and it's kind of like surfing. And you still can fall because I'm still like airing out and stuff like that. But I know how to like not get it too hard, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. There's a risk, but it's minor compared to being like, yeah, I could just snap my femur doing this crazy jump.
Yeah, I get you could do that. It's still really dangerous. I mean, I think about that. I wear a helmet.
Yeah.
I didn't used to do that. I definitely got a really bad concussion when I was younger on September 11th, 2000, in the September 11th.
Damn.
And that was really, I don't remember that day.
Yeah. That's dark, man. What were you doing? What did you do to get that
I was at my
concussion?
friend's place, and I was kind of just doing some pretty routine, and my front wheel slipped and took my face right to the ramp, and um, luckily nothing too bad, that. But that was after that I got a concussion and another break. I was like, no, this was something else.
Yeah.
And then I got into road bikes. I still do bikes. I'm still really obsessed with bikes. So it's still like definitely a passion of mine still.
Yeah. So I want to jump back to some of the stuff with Zeena, because I do think that because you guys released that record somewhat recently, and it's really good, right? I mean, it's really interesting. It's very I don't know what the right word is. Let's say lush, right? There's a lot going on, and I do think that hearing you talk about the process of actually converting that from the form that was utilized in a performance compared to what's actually released. I mean, I didn't actually know any of that. I figured it was just essentially the same thing. So I think that that's really cool. And what I'm curious about is, what is the role of improvisation for you in those types of things? Because it sounds like it's actually very organized and very structured. But I do know that a lot of folks who make similar types of soundscapes, let's say, and especially Zeena being involved in a lot of like jazz and experimental music, right? That there is a role for improvisation there, and I wonder what the balance is for you.
Yeah. So, the improvisation thing was something that came to me. I didn't find it, meaning like, I didn't, when I started, I guess I should roll back a little bit. So I've been working with this same choreographer who I wrote this music for Zeena, which is how we ended up working together, because Zeena is a collaborator of Jennifer Monson, also just from the '90s, and she brought us both together because she thought we would make something really cool. So
And to
thanks.
clarify, Jennifer is the choreographer. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Jennifer Monson is the choreographer that I work with primarily. She's been one of my longest standing artistic collaborators I've had. We've been working together for almost 11 years ish now or something. Maybe 12 or 13 years. And really early on, basically the way I met her, I was doing an undergrad. I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and she moved there from New York. She lived in New York for like most of her life, and then she got a teaching job and moved there. I picked up a random job because someone wanted to do video editing. So she hired me as an undergrad student to do video editing and to teach her how to do it. And then we worked together maybe just once or twice. And then she was like, hey, she knew that I was kind of interested in sound, because when we got together, she was asking me what I was doing at the time. And then she's like, oh, I have a performance next week up in Chicago at Lynx Hall with this dancer, for an improvisation like mini festival. Do you want to come and play music? And I was like, I've never done it before. I was like, I don't like what, like I don't even have instrument. Like I guess I got my computer.
I got a
Like I
smoke
never.
detector.
Yeah, I mean that was even before I was doing that. I was really like just playing around with like Fruity Loops and like just like software, and I wasn't really into hardware because I didn't have any. But I did have like a little like I think I had like a drum pad, like a pad or some kind of like MIDI control thing. But she was like, "Oh, you want to do this?" And I was like, "Yeah, what the hell? I'll give it a shot." And then it was during St. Patrick's Day, and it was at Lynx Hall, and it was near Wrigleyville, and it was so loud next door. There's a bar, and it was just like like thumping, and she was so upset because she's just like really sensitive, detailed,
Yeah.
oriented, like enjoys silence, an active listener, like hung out with John Cage, like all this. And I did something where I like played a tone, so it kind of like I tried to cancel out the like noise that was happening. It
The
was more like
revelry. You're like, all right, what frequency
yeah,
cancels out like bros in green shirts high fiving? Let's see if we can find that.
yeah. So I showed up and I was like, damn, like I gotta play music and this horrible like what. So I like spent the whole time I was kind of like just trying to figure out how I could make frequencies that you couldn't really hear next door, or like I was just like playing around, and then she ended up like loving it. And then shortly after that, like 6 months later, she got in contact with me, and she was like, I have a solo show at the Kitchen in New York, and the Kitchen is like a one of the most highly prestigious performing arts venues in New York City. It's located like on the like lower west side or lower east side of Manhattan, and it's been there. The Beastie Boys have played. You know, like it's right by that above ground old train that they turned into a kind of.
Oh,
Anyways,
the like the new like trail, you mean? Well, not new at this point. Yeah.
yeah, like where they converted the old like tram in lower Manhattan. Um, anyways, so she was like, I'm doing an evening like a solo. Do you want to? Would you be interested in that? And then I was like, sure, yeah, like I'm down. And then it turned out, I mean, it was a crazy experience. I was really young, and it was like the first thing I ever made. And we sold, you know, like she's a big name in New York, so and it was her solo show, and she was like around like 60 years old. So just like the kind of endurance it takes to perform in front of someone for over an hour, it's just like it was a really incredible piece, and we sold out like, you know, 8 out of 8 nights, and you know, a lot of people saw the work, and I just like all of a sudden became an improviser, you know, like through her, because Jennifer is her core practice as a choreographer is built upon improvisation, and she uses improvisation as a way to generate dance material, similar to musicians, as a way where you improvise with someone, and that's a way that you can create songs or create music. You know, this would be what some people call jamming. Um, but she has a deep respect and love and admiration for improvisation, and that is like the core of her practice. She's an improvisational dancer, I guess you would say. Um, but that word is really, you know, like a lot of people might think that word and think of people just like, you know, moving their arms around and like connecting with the
Yeah.
earth
Just
and like
goofing.
um, just goofing. But improvisational dancer just really means that you're using tools, you're using improvisation as a way to generate material, to like, because as an artist, when you just go from an idea, especially as a dancer, you go from like nothing to an evening length piece, you know, that you have to sustain the attention of people for an hour. You know, it's a way to kind of like generate material. And you know, Jennifer is, you know, an example of kind of how she does this is she had a really famous project that she was following the migration of animals like in real time with dancers over months. So she followed like osprey from the north corner of Maine all the way down to like through Cuba all the way down to South America, and traveled with like animals. And it's like part of the idea is that while you're, you know, doing that you're generating material, like because you're literally traveling, hanging out on beaches, birding. So it's just kind of like finding ways that you can kind of like take your, and this is maybe something going back to what we were saying that artists are maybe more interested in, uh, is that like the idea of taking the work out of the studio, and making it elsewhere. And that's like a lot of what I do. Is my intention is to not really make or present all the work in the studio, but you know, to like present it, for instance, like in an ice cream truck. Like I wanted, like it's literally meant to be heard outside, or just kind of thinking about, you know, those kind of things. But so improvisation, yeah, has just been like a way that I use personally in my work to kind of create work. But there's never like there's always like a means to the end kind of idea where like, um, and especially with working with Zeena and Jennifer, part of improvisation is just developing material and then like fine tuning that material over and over and over again, or doing something like Jennifer uses a lot of scores. So for people who don't know what a score is, you could create a score that you could kind of follow. Like for a really simple one for a musician would be over 10 minutes, you have to go from quiet to maximum loud and see what happens in that 10 minutes. And then we do the 10 minutes, and then you talk about it for 10 minutes about what happened. And then maybe that in those 10 minutes, something with 30 seconds of it was really cool, and then that part becomes now part of the piece. And so part of our process a lot is using scores and trying out and experimenting, and seeing what occurs in those moments, and then like refining that over and over again. Like it's like mini sketches that then like stick. And you put that aside and you remember what you did, and then you puzzle all those things together. And that's part of what I do with sound work too. It is like try to, narrative is something that you have to think about when you're making this work with time-based work. And that's maybe one thing is I think about it less in terms of music, and I usually think about it in terms of time. And maybe that's something that is different than me than like a, I don't know, music person.
Yes. So the product is created through this improvisational process. By the time you're actually performing it, how much of it is still improvised? Does that make sense? Where it's like it sounds to me like you're, you have a rough outline of what you want to do, you're rehearsing it, and you're like, oh, that was actually pretty cool, let's do that again.
Yeah.
And then by the time you actually perform it, is it like, okay, this is pretty much set and maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room, or are you still, improvising large portions of it when it's actually being performed?
Good question. I definitely never ever go out on stage anymore not knowing what I'm gonna do. Like I'm not like that kind of an improviser, and that's why maybe when you think of improvisational jazz, I don't listen to that stuff, and I'll just say it. I'm not into it usually. I appreciate it.
Well, but I mean, even those folks, right? I mean, they have an internal library
Totally.
of licks that they know and things that they're going to do, where it's like, yeah, you're improvising, but you've done something like this hundreds, if not thousands of times. So yes, you may be coming up with something on the fly, but it's like you've played this chord progression before and you kind of know how to connect, this G to this A. Or even if it is in a more like free jazz type of situation, it's like, how to make this burst of sound, and you can sort of call on that when you need it. So I do think that the idea of like, this is just completely new and we have like no idea what we're doing, that it's usually not the case. But sorry to interrupt.
Well, I mean, however, like in the kind of like quote unquote like noise, like capital N noise, that is in the room. Like a lot of the people who make that work, they're out there just exploring their instruments in real time. And maybe some of them are using recorded stuff, or but I do like that idea that as a musician you have a vocabulary in you and you return to that, because that's familiar and your signature mark. But to kind of get back to what you were asking, usually it's the case where everything is very set, meaning like where you are on the stage, where the dancer will be. Like I'm taking cues from the dancers are taking cues from me. However, we do leave structure inside of there where like if one of the dancers, like if Jennifer starts improvising and she goes in like 2 or 3 more minutes than it's supposed to, like I'm adjusting in real time, and and then when we're making that track longer, and just or like that kind of push and play of a performance. And that's the coolest thing about a performance is like having all of this structure set up, and then every night, it's just like with a live band too. It's like the kind of fun part is like when it feels really good when you're hitting those kind of like transitions. And I think there's sections where we're kind of doing some improvising. But if we're just improvising, there's like literally, we know that after the dancer finishes that, it's Jeff's turn to improvise for a minute and a half. And so there are a couple moments where I'm just like improvising, but it's already something that was developed and made. And it's like, oh, I'm going to that instrument and it's this key, or I'm going to that thing and I'm going to do this. But I'm kind of doing it differently every night, maybe maybe it's softer, maybe it's louder. But I think in terms of like the performance aspect, it can change depending on who the choreographer is, or if I'm just working with just a musician. But we're definitely like following a pretty rigid structure. And then in a similar way to like, in like metal or like whatever doom, like the kind of coolest shit is the transitions. That's really where people shine, and like when you're like and you experience it. And that's really true. I deeply think about that too. And like I'm a huge, like transitions are really important and interesting, and something that I like I think that's where a lot of people shine or don't shine, for sure.
Yeah, and even in something that's less structured than a traditional song, that transition point is still sort of like you're saying, that you've established enough expectation with whatever current part that you're doing, such that when you transition, right, that's a release for people, right? It's like,
Totally.
oh, even if it is more of like a soundscape or whatever, that you can get that pent up tension and then do something with it by transitioning into a different part. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
Yeah. And I think that, I've really like tried it all. Like I've done the things where you just like, improv, like where I got paired up randomly with one person and we just did something, I've done, so I feel like I've given it a shot. I've tried just doing like different kind of ways. But, I guess I've just been really informed by working and figuring out how improvisation works for me, which is like improvising like privately, and then having that as a way to generate material that then I know, because like now when I perform or I go on, like I really want to know, I want to make sure that I'm playing exactly the right thing. Like before I used to maybe be a little more exploratory, and I definitely in my early career, like I wanted to be like the loudest, noisiest. Like my early stuff is very hard to listen to. But I've really like found my craft, and I know how to make soft note, like it's just me developing as an artist, I guess, is like, maybe I did have that experience that every artist has who is like punk and they just want to go out and be like the loudest and whatever.
Yeah.
And then I've been really like, trying to have that. I'm more self-reflexive recently, and just trying to think about like, oh, my work is really different now, like but my work is still like constantly misinterpreted, but I like that. Some people think I'm a noise artist, some people think I make ambient music, some people think I, like the kind of a thing is all over the place, and that's kind of like the allure. And I like that part of it.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about this a little bit before, but I think that it can be appreciated as that, right?
Yeah.
That if you're like, okay, I like ambient music or whatever, and you put on something like your music for phone booths or whatever, it's like, okay, this fits right in with the Brian Eno and William Basinski stuff that I like, and
Yeah.
cool, fine.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think part of it is just kind of knowing, like, yeah, like if you, like, I know it's kind of the thing of like it's like, don't ever make yourself make a genre specific thing. But, it's kind of funny because a lot of people listen to my work and don't even care or think about that there's a lot of conceptual stuff behind it. And,
Yeah, no.
that's fine with me. And it's like, that is more acceptable in the music world, meaning like in the music world, like when you get it inside the artist's head, it's like from the book or from the movie, or you really have to dig down to like think of, like find out like what is making like musicians like make their work. But in in the artwork, like I'm presenting all that material because I'm also kind of interested in it from the context of like an art context, because I guess I just want my work to be able to be complicated or complex enough that it can live in the art world, and that the people in the art world, like I know how to present and protect my work in the art world, to say like, oh, here's the research, here's the context. But it's really hard to do that for both at the same time, because then if you're doing that and also the music might not be as musicy as so you really have, like the thing with Zeena, I was like, we're making a music record. I kept having to tell I'm like, we're making a vinyl music record. I'm not trying to make this like juicy for the art gallery. Like it's really a music record. And so I've also tried to just, now I've kind of come to that so many times now, that I can kind of identify and think about who's your audience, what is the work, because it's also based around who's asking me to do stuff, because sometimes I get a commission from a dancer and sometimes I'm making music on my own. And they're just different inputs.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and you're speaking to a tension that I think is interesting, where, like you said, the high art world does have this element of, hate to say it, but just like pretension, right? Where it's like, oh, if you do stuff that falls outside of this narrow band of acceptable things, like this is no longer going to fly in this world, right? And you get people who can become neurotic about that, where they're like, oh no, I don't want the art world to think this about me, because then I'll no longer be able to show in galleries or whatever.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, if you're making music, sort of like you're saying, that I think that folks who are plugged in and this is going to be me being pretentious or potentially talking down on people, which I don't mean to do, but I think it's just the reality of the situation. If you have people who are plugged into what's going on, right, and I can use metal as an example since I know a decent amount about this, to me, there's like these very clear lineages of artists that were influenced by each other, and you kind of know the history of different genres and like where things fall even within the music world is like, oh, this is, you know, more artistic, this is more sort of like corny, this is kind of like lowbrow or whatever. But the reality is listeners don't make those distinctions, right? That there's just like, I have this Five Finger Death Punch record, I have this Pantera record, I have this Obituary record, I have this Watain record, and I have my friend's band that's maybe a little bit more underground, but I also like it. And this is all just metal to me. And it's not clear that, like, to me, it's like, oh, that's in that lane, that's in that lane, that's in that lane. And no judgment on how much you like or dislike those things. But I think for most people, there's no bright lines between different categories like that.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, like I've done like major museum show, like I had, you know, I've done that route. And I'm not presenting my work in the same way, in the same context, because I know it will be a miss, you know? So like when, you know, the other project we didn't get to talking about, which is Radius, which is like my curatorial sort of project that I started and been doing for the past 10 years, which has kind of kept me in touch with both the gallery world and also like the academic world through that project. And it's like, yeah, you're gonna, but also the sound art has a real tough spot in that world because you don't make anything that can necessarily sell. So like, cool, I had this major museum show, 1 million plus people saw it in New York.
Yeah,
but
no rich collector is like, let me get that for my wall. Yeah.
No one bought this show, you know, like, so it's like, cool, I got the entrance fee, like, but all the other people in there that had like sound sculptures and stuff, like someone was making like beautiful hand vases that were like turned into speakers, like, cool, the value of those is insane. So like, it's crazy that like, you know, that was like quote unquote the biggest show I've had at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City, like right in Midtown Manhattan. 1 million plus people see it. But like I got kind of no opportunities off of that show, albeit a lot of people saw the work, and you know I'm still really excited that I was in it. But then, you know, you think of like other times that I played a small show and then that turned into, you know, so it's kind of like it's all a kind of crock pot, and it's just sort of like, you know, that's why Radius has been helpful for me, because I know that that's situated in the art world and I can play to those strengths all the time. And I know how to talk about that work in the context of like theory. And so, yeah, it's just kind of, it's funny, you know, and I'm with you, like metal's metal. Like I hear you.
So the Radius stuff, that's you more curating stuff rather than creating, correct?
Yeah. Exactly. So, yeah, the quick synopsis of Radius is it's been around for 10 years. I started it in 2010. And it was like a curatorial project. So, you know, like how a lot of other people, they'll start their DIY gallery space and you get a little storefront and you turn it into a gallery. Well, I had a radio transmitter, an illegal one. And I was like, well, here's my gallery. It's on air, you know? And so that was kind of the impetus. And I got a transmitter from this group called Temporary Services, which is this art group here in Chicago. They loaned it to me. And then for the past 10 years, I've been kind of doing broadcasts of artists' work from all around the world. So right now we're at like episode 93, and we've worked with something around 400 artists in total from over 20 different countries. The project has taken me around the world. I've been able to talk about it in Paris, all over Europe. It got really popular in Europe really early on, and that also like informed my career too. So I've been also, you know, this entire time I was putting like 50-50 into Radius, and then another 50 into my personal work. And it was kind of like my project where I was still really interested in this work. I still wanted to work with artists. And part of it was just kind of, my curiosity and development of that project has also now turned into it's kind of like one of the maybe 3 or 4 art projects that specifically deal with radio and transmission art in the world. And so it's now really, if it's become more of an archive, like an educational archive for a lot of people. I was actually supposed to go and talk at the Library of Congress in October on the project, in their like radio. They have like a radio conference there. So it's become like this kind of like historical thing that's people are going to look to in the future of this like subgenre within sound art, which is radio art. And this is like a project that has a huge archive. I think in total it's like over 3 full days.
Yeah.
If you wanted to binge it. You know, of like artists who are experimenting with using radio as like a element in their work, whether that's using radio as an instrument, whether that's developing works that like require radio broadcast to like happen to make the work, and then also just doing like tons of site specific projects, and really trying to make radio this mobile thing that happens like out in the world and not just like in the studio of commercial stations.
Yeah, which is, I mean, as we've discussed previously, this is kind of it's a different lane than either the like punk show, okay, we're going to see this band play or whatever, nor is it the gallery, which is like, here's the art, here's a little placard on the wall with the artist's birth date and the thing that they're commenting on, right? That there's a different lane, which is like, here's a radio broadcast that's going into the world and we're going to see what happens.
I mean, that's like what the project is like, a radio art project about radio, so it's like the output of the project is literally you're supposed to hear it on air. But we do put it on SoundCloud, and that's kind of like looping back into that idea is, this is another project that's been misrepresented and miscommunicated, and I love it also. Like I still get CDs from like metal bands who send it to radio and they're like, hey, can you air our projects? And I love it, and some people think it's a podcast because it's on SoundCloud. And I got on SoundCloud really early with Radius. And I was putting out a lot of content. So I got a lot of followers early on. So we were getting a lot of listens. And so people thought we were like a podcast, and other people thought we were like the newest, like whatever. It was just like, it's pretty funny that project has this, I've kind of specifically designed it to be really mysterious like that. Like I didn't put my name on the project until like 5 years ago. It was just kind of like its own thing, and I was answering the emails and whatever. And I've had other people, help me along the way, like designers and editors and stuff. But
you're purposefully in some weird liminal cultural space.
For sure, yeah.
Defies legibility.
That's incredible. But that's kind of like, I wanted to make a radio project that was that, because that's the most interesting part about pirate radio is like this idea that like you caught it or you didn't. And like, I have such like dreamy like ideas about like pirate radio that was happening in like London and like the early aughts, and like the development of like all these music genres that happened just from like pirate broadcasters.
Dude, wasn't there some crazy thing with Miami Bass where they had some pirate radio station that was like playing early 2 Live Crew? And
yeah,
dude, I wish there's tons of
weird pirate, like there's a pirate radio station that was in the South Side, that was in the South Side of Chicago, that was in a community church basement. And then at one point, like some gang took it over and started like using it as a way to like divert the police because like everyone would tune in and be like, oh, don't go over here, there's cops, so like there's just all these like really cool uses of radio and part of the thing with radio is like, there's nothing like hearing a signal where you don't know who it's coming. It's like something so alluring to that like, I wanted to always build that into that project.
Yeah, you stumbled across something and you're not sure what it is. Is this some weird like Soviet code that's still playing from 1967? Maybe, or maybe it's Jeff.
Maybe
it's Jeff. So one more thing I wanted to ask you about, because we started to talk about some of your work with Jennifer and the choreography, and before we were recording, you mentioned that your performance of Ditch, which you also released recently, which I think is actually really nice. I think that's one of your more recent things that I've enjoyed the most. Somehow ended up with you being arrested. What's the rundown? What happened?
Yeah, so I'll just try to truncate the story a little bit. So the project you're referring to, Ditch, which turned into a cassette tape. Um, was originally commissioned by the same choreographer, Jennifer Monson. And we were doing a lot of work at dawn. So for several years, we would have rehearsal at dawn, and we would go, and we would do this in New York. She lives in downstate Illinois. And she was also doing this for the dancers. And this was like, again, part of their process of like developing work is they would go out to the prairie down in East Central Illinois, and they would go out like, you go 4:30 in the morning when it's still pitch black, and you go out and you're out there through just having the sun come up until it's fully bright, and you just experience how slow that is. It was really a work about slowness. And so we had the opportunity to present this work, and we were able to do it. And it was the most badass location ever. It's like right in the lower Manhattan, like a couple blocks from like Wall Street, on on the development side of a pier. So a lot of in New York City, if you're cruising in lower Manhattan, there's like Pier 55 and Pier 44, and they're kind of turning these old piers of shipping piers into like public parks. So we were able to like get permission to do this performance at dawn at this pier, and overlooking the pier is like the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan. Like it's like the ultimate cityscape view, because you're like in the middle of downtown Manhattan. And so it was a really hard piece to pull off because of like rain. We had to bring speakers and pull them out to this park. And of course, this is at dawn, so it's a real big ask for the audience.
Set your alarm.
You got to have a pretty hardcore audience to come out. Set your alarm. Get there, because we're starting, and you can't start late. So then we did two rehearsals the day 2 days before we were supposed to actually do the performance. Both of them got rained out, and it sucked because I had a whole tech crew, because you can't just I had to set up, like, the pier is maybe 200 feet long or something. So this crew would have to show up in the morning, set up all these speakers, and I'm plopped in the middle, and then the dancers are kind of around me. We had two rehearsals, and we got rained out both times. And then the actual performance date looks like it's a go. So we have our last rehearsal, and I pack up all my stuff and put it into my Pelican cases, and I give it to the production assistant person who is supposed to drive my stuff to like this warehouse that's stored, and then he was supposed to come pick it up at like 3:30 and bring it all with the other stuff. Pretty boring. So I go home and I go to sleep, and I'm staying with the choreographer. And our morning routine for these rehearsals was we were staying in Greenpoint, so we would get on our bikes and we would just ride our bikes over there, because there's no train available or anything that early. So it's the night before, and I get a call at 3:30, which is an hour before I'm supposed to wake up. And it's the production assistant, and he says, all of your instruments have been misplaced. And I'm like, whoa, what does that mean? And meanwhile, the choreographer, like the thing is there's like hundreds of people are supposed to show up. The New York Times is there, all like the press people like ready, the the whole thing is set up, big budget or whatever. It's a pain in the ass to do anything in New York City outside in a park. So he tells me, he's like, oh, well, they've just been misplaced. And my Jennifer gets on, she starts yelling at him, being like, what do you mean? Like screaming at this kid. And he's like, well, they were misplaced. I misplaced them. And we're like, well, what does that mean? And like, he's like, well, are we canceling the show? And I'm like, well, you lost all of my instruments. It's like 5 G's worth of stuff, like that's the show. And he's like, well, I don't know what happened. I came and it was just gone. And he was just being very like, he wouldn't say what happened really. And we're like, what, and he's just so mad that she hangs up the phone on him. And so, I'm like, I look at Jennifer and I'm like, well, what do you want to do? And she's like, all right, well, let's ride our bike over there. And we show up, and, already there's maybe 150 people who woke up at 4 a.m. to show up. And the guy's there, and he says, well, I didn't bring it back to the place, and I came back to my trunk and it was gone in the morning. Like he didn't do it, and I'm like, okay. And then so there's all these people there, and then they're trying to I right away I told them to take all the speakers down. I'm like, well, I can't play music, so this is ruined. I've been working on the project for literally 5 years, and it was over for me. And so the dancers were like, well, we got to do it. So I sat there, sidelined it. The dancers made the work. The New York Times wrote about the work with no music and etc. I'm pretty salty, like the guy ends up getting fired like right after the show, the whole deal. I thought I was out all my instruments. We had a couple more shows that we were supposed to play. And there's still nothing. He's just like, well, I don't know what happened to it, and I'm like, okay. He says no one broke into the car or anything. So then I'm like still trying to figure out what's going on, and I leave. I go on my bike. The performance ends. I kind of ghost. I went and sat by the water, and I'm like looking at my phone, like who's gonna hit me up, And someone named Supreme Vinny sends me a message on Instagram, and I didn't see it, and he sent it at like 3 a.m. or something, and it went to my spam in the Instagram, and he's like, I have your stuff. You want it back? Because I like literally have Pelican cases with my name all over it and stuff, And I'm like, fuck, it's like 6 a.m. and I'm like, so I text him back and I'm like, yeah, I want my stuff back. Like, where do you want to meet me? Like, what's the deal? Like, are you like, what you want money? Like what, like what's going on? And I'm freaking out and I'm like, where, like nothing still. And I'm just refreshing and nothing comes up. And then I basically, I check my Gmail and I go into my spam and I see from the New York Police Department. And then it has a bunch of like scrambled kind of glitchy stuff. And it says like, go to the first district at this time. We have your stuff. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I look up the first district. I can bike there. I'm like first one in the door, and I sit there and like I get there and then they're like, oh, is this your stuff? And I'm like, yeah, this is my stuff. And he's like, well, you can't have it because you're not the one who lost it, And so I'm like, okay. And so now I call the guy who just got fired, and I'm like, can you come meet me at the first precinct? That's the least you can do. And so they sign it out to him. And I get all my stuff back. Nothing is missing at all. And then I get a message from Supreme Vinny, and he's like, oh, I found this stuff right outside the venue. The guy just went to go to his car and never put it in his car and left it in the street. And it's right in like the area where, you're in Wall Street. You can't have a black Pelican case sitting out in the middle of Manhattan. And so this guy finds it and he takes them. And it turns out that he opened them up and he saw that it was my stuff, and he tried to contact me on Instagram, and he just brought it to the police station. He's like, it looked like it was important.
Thanks, Vinny.
I'm like, thanks, Vinny. Can I, like, you really saved me, like I didn't tell him that all this other, who cares? I'm like, you really saved me. That was a cool, really cool thing. And I'm like, can I buy you lunch or something? He's like, no, just paid for it. Like, never met the guy. He's just like Supreme Vinny from the Bronx. He just like, picked up all my stuff, brought it back. So that was a huge headache. That sucked. But that's kind of that was the story how I ended up at the police station at 6.
There you go. So you didn't get arrested. You just had some Pelican cases to pick up thanks to the actions of bystander Supreme Vinny.
Yeah. I mean, good thing I didn't light up on him in the Instagram and be like, why did you steal all my stuff? Because then that would have been even worse. But yeah, I guess like it's kind of it ended up being like the classic New York story, like here's a New Yorker, like the New Yorker's got you.
Yeah, totally.
It's kind of cool.
Well, Jeff, what if people want to check out some of your art and sounds and such? I mean, you got a Bandcamp, you got the Radius. What are the outlets that you recommend people go to?
Yeah, I put all of my work up on my Bandcamp. That's the main listening platform. I have some stuff on Spotify, but it's a real pain in the ass to get some of this stuff on Spotify if you don't have like the gracings of a label. So I have a couple stuff on Spotify, but Bandcamp is the main thing. I usually sell like versions of all the records or CDs or tapes that I get there. But also, I'm pretty active on Twitter at Jeff Kolar, and also my Instagram. So I'm kind of also like putting plugs if new stuff comes out on there. But the majority of it goes up on SoundCloud, yeah, or sorry, Bandcamp. Yeah.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all of the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.